Welcome to Wild Turkey Science, a podcast made possible by Turkeys for Tomorrow. I'm Dr. Marcus Lashley, Professor of Wildlife Ecology at the University of Florida.
And I'm Dr. Will Gulsby, Professor of Wildlife Ecology and Management at Auburn University. We're both lifelong hunters and devoted scientists who are passionate about hunting, managing, and researching wild turkeys.
In this podcast, we'll explore turkey research, speak to the experts in the field, and address the difficult questions related to wild turkey ecology and management.
Our goal
is to serve as your connection to wild turkey science. October.
I'm not doing that again. Don't even try to bait me into it.
Oh.
Well, I'm excited about this episode today, like I am all the episodes.
I love that you say that for every single one.
I mean, it's like kind of one of those throwaway lines that helps you get going. You know what I'm saying? Sometimes the hardest thing to say is the first thing you say.
Yeah, I agree with that.
But it's a listener requested episode that seems pretty popular.
So we've got the whole month where we focused on oaks, and we're going to talk about oak management some in this one, but I think it might get a little more broad than that because we've had, like you said, consistently people asking us to cover herbicides in more detail.
Right.
So some of that might apply to oak management. Some of it might apply to other systems. But, I think this is a good one. It's time to cover it. We're probably getting asked about this as much as anything else.
Yeah, and we're probably going to go into some of the more, generic herbicides today that a lot of people may already be familiar with, but many of you may not. And so I think it's a good starting point regardless. And even if some of these are herbicides that you're familiar with, you may not be aware of all the ways that you can potentially use them to improve turkey habitat.
Yeah, and I have, first of all, I don't know what Will prepared for this, and he does not know what I prepared for it, but I do have a few that are off the beaten path for most people probably.
Well, good. Mine are going to be mostly on the beaten path.
Well, that's okay too.
All right. So let's start out with probably the chemical that most people are familiar with, which is glyphosate. Roundup is what most people know it by, but it's off patent now, so you can buy it in a number of generic product names, and that's why oftentimes you want to know the active ingredient of these herbicides because that helps you potentially get them for cheaper. Although sometimes the name brand product is better for whatever reason. But glyphosate is a wide spectrum herbicide that kills almost everything green when applied to the leaves while the plant is actively growing.
So it's got to contact the leaf and be, taken into the plant to have activity.
Right.
So if you spray it directly on soil, there's no activity there.
Right.
I'm just trying to make sure that that's clear because some of them that we talk about, you do plant, you can use it pre-plant incorporated or pre-emergence, which would be spraying it onto the soil or incorporating it into soil.
Yeah. You mentioning that kind of jogged an idea in my memory that I thought about leading up to this episode, and I didn't know if we wanted to get into it or not, but I just decided I feel like it's a topic that comes up frequently enough that we should probably address it here, and that is the potential negative effects of herbicides. I think maybe we should spend a few minutes on that.
Okay.
And as far as like the acute toxicity to humans and wildlife, most of your common forestry herbicides pose very little risk in that regard as far as like acutely making someone sick from contact. There are some exceptions to that.
Well, but generally it would be chronic exposure if there's a problem.
Right. But the problem with chronic exposure is that's much more difficult to study. And when I say study, it's not us studying it. These are people that look at different research questions than we do and have completely different skill sets. But when something requires repeated long-term exposure, it becomes much more difficult to prove causation as to whether or not that chemical, resulted in some negative outcome. So first and foremost, just follow the label, right? And follow
Yeah.
the safety precautions on the label when you're applying chemicals. As far as the environmental impact, everything that you do out there, especially if you're spraying a chemical, is going to have some level of effect.
Mm-hmm.
It can be difficult to measure. We may not know what it is, but there is likely an effect there. And so oftentimes, when I'm applying herbicide, the way that I'm thinking about it is, this it would be better not to apply any of this chemical to this area just from if you were trying to avoid any negative impact of the chemical on the area. But a lot of times when I apply it, I'm thinking, is that trade-off worth the improvement in habitat
Mm-hmm.
outcomes that I'm going to get for whatever species I'm managing for? And so as a
Right.
perfect example of that, I got a listener question a while back. I mean, this was probably a year ago, and this person asked me specifically after an episode where we had discussed the use of chemicals like glyphosate to improve brooding cover and improve insect production for broods in the areas where it was used. And that listener was concerned that there were some studies showing a negative association between application of glyphosate and insect populations. And the way that I answered that question was, well, first of all, I'm not familiar with that literature, so I really can't speak to it. But what I can speak to is that I have multiple instances of areas that are dominated by a non-native invasive grass that I've gone in and applied an herbicide to that has allowed native plant communities, or allowed me to cultivate those native plant communities back over time. And there's no question that there has been an orders of magnitude increase in insect diversity and abundance in that area
Mm-hmm.
as a result of applying that herbicide and the plant community changes that it elicited.
Right. Yeah, I think about it from the perspective of, wild turkey. I would say the risk of applying that herbicide is fairly low, but the risk of trying to raise poults with no brooding cover is very high.
Sure.
Right.
That's a much
So,
simpler way to say it.
well, I was trying to condense it down into a different kind of message, but if you're in a situation where you have problematic plants that are hindering you from creating high quality brooding cover, the fact that there's no brooding cover is what's going to kill the turkeys.
That's right.
So, that necessary evil, or it might be warranted in some circumstances like that. So,
Sure. So, going back to glyphosate, thinking about objectives that it's usually applied to accomplish, site preparation, in forestry, oftentimes glyphosate is one of the chemicals that's mixed in to prepare the site for tree planting,
mm,
preparing a field for planting, right? Renovating a field is another example. Spot control of veg is probably the objective that I use glyphosate for more than anything.
mm-hmm,
Just going around and shaping a plant community, particularly in an old field, as Dr. Harper discussed in those 2 episodes that we did with him last summer.
yeah,
Really good episode if you want to go back and listen to those. But he talked about how you can use glyphosate to shape the plant community over time just through spot spraying. And then finally, and it goes kind of hand in hand with that, is exotic cool season grass control.
mm-hmm,
So particularly fescue, glyphosate is going to be the go-to chemical there.
yeah. So I wanted to add to the conversation, and I do have one of them that's probably a little off the beaten path to do so.
Mm-hmm.
The glyphosate is a broad spectrum herbicide, meaning that it kills a large portion of the plants, controls them well that it contacts. And that's important. But there are plants that sometimes are a problem that it's weak on. So there's another product. I don't know if you're familiar with glufosinate.
No, I'm not.
So that would be under the label like Liberty 280. But the glufosinate is also broad spectrum, and it is one that covers some of the weaknesses of glyphosate. So, like, for example, I guess like horse nettle, mustards, dock,
Some
uh,
pigweeds.
pigweeds. Yeah, several species like that. The Roundup will control it, but it's not as effective.
Mm-hmm.
And the glufosinate is stronger on some of those, especially the ones I just said. That said, uh, the glufosinate or Liberty is also weak on a suite of species that glyphosate is strong on. For example, annual ryegrass. Glufosinate is weak on that one. Um, the other thing, glufosinate doesn't have activity on nutsedges, whereas the glyphosate is pretty strong control on that one. So that's another broad spectrum that might be of interest, and it has some applications, I guess,
Mm-hmm.
that might help you if if your weed problems aren't conducive to glyphosate.
Yeah, one other thing I'll mention is that glyphosate sometimes can be weaker on plants that have a really waxy cuticle on their
Mm-hmm.
leaves. So, like if you're further down in the lower coastal plain or pretty much all of Florida, in certain areas, if you have like a lot of gallberry or like wax myrtle or species like that, you may consider going with another chemical if that's primarily what you're trying to control.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But in addition, we mentioned the foliar applications. You can apply glyphosate to cut stumps too. So, like case in point, if you're doing like privet control, Chinese privet control,
Mm-hmm.
you cut the stem down, come back and paint it with a concentrated solution right afterwards to prevent resprouting, and it's effective in that use too.
Yeah. Good stuff.
Anything else on that one?
Well, I kind of wanted to just touch on another aspect of herbicides that for me has really helped me kind of organize. And, we talked about a couple of broad spectrum. Glyphosate is definitely the most used and most known. But we also have selectivity that we can invoke when we're
Mm-hmm.
doing this. And what I mean is some of the most common selectivity would be things that kill grasses but do not kill broadleaf plants, right? So
This is
what's the first
exactly
one?
where I was going.
Oh, is it?
Yeah,
Okay. Well,
keep going.
I didn't mean
No,
to
you're
cut you
good.
off, but
I think it's a good
uh
thing.
what's the first one that comes to mind for you that would be grass
Clethodim.
selective? Clethodim. Very common. I would say one of the top used, selective herbicides in our field because
Mm-hmm.
it's so effective at killing a lot of different grasses. Really effective with crab grasses and foxtail and Johnson grass, several things like that that you might have problems with. Post would be another one that we use commonly that's grass selective. We also have some that are broadleaf selective. So, in other words, you could spray them right over grass and they don't have activity on the grass, but they will kill broadleaf plants, forbs, or woody plants. The What's the one that comes to mind for you with that one?
2,4-D.
Super 2,4-D, but by far most common. But we also might have clarity. Forgot the active ingredient in that one.
Mm.
Atrazine is another one that's fairly common, especially in corn country.
Mm-hmm.
So, there are lots of different options that you can use to take advantage of selectivity. If you have, like, for example, if you're trying to manage for forbs and you don't have any problematic forbs, you might be able to just use a selective herbicide to kill things that aren't forbs.
Yeah. Like a lot of times, if you're on a open area that has a long history of mowing, it's probably all that history has probably favored grasses over forbs,
Mm.
and your grass density is likely too high. Your grass density can even be too high if you've had done a repeated pattern of frequent prescribed fire during the wintertime.
Mm-hmm.
Grass density can get too high. So those are both scenarios where you might look to using a grass selective herbicide like clethodim to thin down the grass density and give a
Mm-hmm.
competitive advantage to the forbs.
Yeah. So another one with selectivity that I think is pretty important is that we use pursuit generally.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, but basically, you can apply that to legumes and control many things that aren't legumes. With pursuit, you'd want to use that post emergence if it was in clovers, which are
Mm-hmm.
legumes. Like you don't want to spray it as a pre emergence, but that's one that you can use either way,
Right.
and it's sometimes really effective if you're anticipating some problematic weeds like crabgrasses or Johnson grass. Uh, you know, some of those things.
So
It
pretty much
will,
anywhere with an ag history.
yeah, but it also will limit some of your problematic forb species, like the cocklebur that I mentioned earlier, or uh, horse nettle, morning glory. That's one we deal with all the time. That's the problem. So it can, cover a wider spectrum of grasses and forbs that that you're trying to keep from competing with your planting, or if you're trying to steer the community for brooding cover even.
Mm-hmm. Good stuff. So the next one that I had left on here to cover is a Mazapic, aka Plateau.
Mm-hmm.
Is going to be the name brand that
Oh,
it's
did I
most.
steal some of your thunder?
You did a little bit, but that's
Oh,
fine. I mean, I don't think
sorry.
it's. I mean, our thunder is synergistic, Marcus.
Oh, okay.
Maybe we
We're
should
we're
be
th- we're thundering
talking.
together.
I mean, or storm. I don't feel like storm analogies are good to have right now. We've
No,
been
they're not.
bombarded with too many of those lately.
I know.
The cool thing about a Mazapic, aka Plateau, is that it targets a lot of non-native grasses, while not targeting native warm season grasses.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and the reason for that, my understanding, and correct me if I'm wrong, Marcus, is that native warm season grasses are C4 grasses. So they fix carbon into 4 units, whereas a lot of cool season grasses are C3 grasses. And so it is particularly effective against the C3 grasses. But if you have like an introduced or a non-native invasive species that is a C4 grass, like Bermuda grass, it's not particularly effective against that one.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Good stuff.
So, if you've got a bunch of fescue or annual ryegrass or smooth brome that's coming up in native warm season grasses, this would likely be a good herbicide solution to that. Um, and keep in mind that Amazopic does have both foliar and soil activity, so it's going to provide some residual control. So it's probably, or it's something that you would want to think carefully about if you were planning on coming back and planting that area shortly after
Mm-hmm.
herbicide application. Make sure that you read the label and see what's the right way to go about that, or what the time frame is.
Yeah, and how are you applying that?
What's that?
The herbicide application, how are you applying it?
I mean, I was primarily referring to broadcast applications there.
Okay. But it does have soil residual activity, right?
It does. Yeah.
So
And
I'm
I was thinking primarily about post emergence too. Are you want to talk about pre emergence use?
well, I was thinking about pre-emergence because there are a few of them, and that one's one where I have heard landowners that are trying to use a pre-emergence application to steer the community because they have particular problematic weeds, or
Mm-hmm.
maybe their soil is super productive, and it kind of gets real thick real fast
Yeah.
after disturbance. So this may be a opportunity for you to disc and use one of these pre-emergence herbicides where you're not planting anything. You're just using them to selectively allow desirable plants to succeed and suppress things that are undesirable.
Yeah.
It may be a way for you to get to your brooding cover really quickly. And I think in some cases, it depends on what your weed problems are, but there are some that are super consistent, like the crabgrasses, foxtails, goosegrass, that kind of stuff, that some of these pre-emergents might be a good way for you to start,
Mm-hmm.
where it kind of gives you that, that screen,
Yeah.
right, where you can screen out those problematic plants.
Yeah. That's a good point. And I'd never even seen that use case until, I mean, it was almost a couple of years ago now that you and I were out with that landowner, and he had done that in a couple places. And I was really
Mm-hmm.
impressed with the response,
Yeah,
where he
out in
had applied it.
Mississippi.
Yeah. Where he had applied it
Yeah.
before winter disking. And in contrast with the plots where it had not been applied, I felt like the structure was much more favorable for broods where it
Mm-hmm.
had been.
Yeah, he's just too productive.
Yeah.
Things move way too fast. So, another one that I like that is really effective with several grasses and a couple of problematic forb species, it's prowl.
Mm-hmm.
That one, I like it. So I've recommended it for various things over the years, but it's one that's pretty effective on grasses and might help you.
Cool. The next one that I've got is a Mazapir.
That one's a good forestry one.
Yeah. Going back into the woods with this one, of course, but it can be used in fields as well. So a Mazapir is often most commonly known as Arsenal or Arsenal AC, which is the applicator's concentrate. This is another pretty broad spectrum herbicide. It has foliar activity, it has soil activity as well. What it's probably most famous for is that it can be sprayed over the tops of loblolly pines to kill woody competition, and most
Mm-hmm.
oftentimes that's targeted towards controlling sweet gum within loblolly pine plantations. And on many occasions, I've recommended to landowners that either buy a new property that hasn't been burned in a long time, or they decide to start implementing a burn rotation for the first time on their property that they've owned for a while but maybe haven't been burning, and it's developed that either really dense understory layer of woody trees and shrubs, or maybe it's even formed a mid-story of those
Mm-hmm.
species by this point in time. Arsenal AC is a good way to set that back, and then you can usually spray. You usually come into a stand like that, spray it in late summer, early fall, allow that vegetation to die back, and then by wintertime, go back in and start introducing your fire, and then get it on a burn rotation going forward.
Mm-hmm.
And I've seen some areas that have been treated exactly that way that have outstanding plant community, species composition, and structure for brooding.
Mm-hmm. I agree. That's a really effective herbicide from forestry standpoint. Is what we use commonly in forest stand improvement. I will say it has soil residual activity, and be careful if you're using it in a place where you have desirable hardwoods.
Yep.
You don't want to, spill it on the ground under a prized oak or something
Yeah.
like that. Like even something that simple. I've heard
And
lots of horror stories, and I've killed a couple of trees on accident from that same thing.
yeah, and if you're hiring a contractor to apply it as well, consider where they're spraying and the technique that you're using. For example, you wouldn't want an aerial application of a Mazapir right next to a streamside management zone,
Mm-hmm.
full of, productive oaks that is an outstanding turkey roost, because you might get some drift into that area and kill some of those trees.
Yeah.
That's not to say that you should never use it. I mean, just it should be done very judiciously, and you should match the application technique to the situation and how risk averse you are with applying
Yeah.
the chemical within an area.
Well,
But
and I kind of also take the perspective. I'm not really one that is trying to lean heavily on herbicides. I use them
mhm,
when they're necessary, and I'm trying to do it the appropriate way to maximize the outcome. and hopefully minimize the use in the future.
Yeah.
That's kind of my general perspective on it. So I think that's a good way to think about it. We're trying to, especially in the field setting, a lot of times you just have a problem species that you have to deal with that way. There's not another good way for you to go about it to get rid of the problem. And once you address it, then you don't have to worry about it anymore.
Yeah.
You're in maintenance mode
Exactly.
again.
And that's the way I teach it to my students is I want to use the least amount of herbicide that I can as infrequently as possible to solve, any plant problems that I have, any issues that I'm trying to address. So you can help do that by choosing the right one and applying it at the proper rate with the proper technique to begin with.
Yeah.
Some other here and there things about Arsenal or Imazapyr. I mentioned that it does have a field application too. It's pretty good at killing Bermuda grass,
Yep.
and Bermuda grass can be really difficult to kill.
Yeah. But keep in mind that soil residual activity, that's going to last, more than 12 months generally.
Yeah.
But 18 months,
Right.
pretty common.
Yeah.
So, which it may be really useful for you, but also even like if you're spraying pine plantation, I just got a question about this. If you're using it for site preparation to plant pine, you're going to have limited plant community responses from a lot of desirable stuff in that setting. I mean, it releases blackberry and the pine, which is the whole point.
Right.
But when that application is applied, a lot of the good stuff is also hindered.
Yeah,
for a long duration.
And I haven't used it or studied it at site prep, an application that you just described, but I have studied it at mid rotation. And at mid rotation, you've got a couple of years where it seems like it cuts down on plant community diversity and abundance. But particularly when you pair it with fire after a couple of years, if you just contrast it with stands that are only burned that come from the same starting point, forb coverage was greater in the stands that were treated with both arsenal and fire.
Yeah.
So, I'm not, like I said, I'm not as familiar with using it at, or haven't studied it at site prep, but at mid rotation, that's some of the context of what you can expect.
That's the point of the practice at site prep is to give the trees a head start on the competition.
Right.
So that's the whole purpose, but that creates a problem because you basically take the first 2 years, you got a 1 year seedling you put in the ground, and then 2 more years where everything is stunted. And then you the window of time when it would be high quality for brooding or nesting cover is basically the whole time that it was excluded because of that soil residual activity. So the context matters a lot, and I had the same experience, although I know you had a research study focused on that. I've had some experience with it, and in that mid rotation, especially when paired with fire, there's definitely some circumstances where it's really valuable.
Well, that's because at mid rotation we're doing other things that are specifically targeted at developing the understory. It's a very different objective that we're chasing after there. Whereas, like you mentioned, at site prep, if you get a really clean site prep and you plant, high quality trees, get a couple of good growing seasons, within a few years, they've already kind of closed canopy and that deal is done until you can thin those trees again. But at mid rotation, specifically if we're thinning below optimal stocking density, we're not trying to carry as much wood volume throughout that rotation because we want more sunlight to grow plants for turkeys. In that scenario, it can be a useful renovation step. But I would much prefer to have a stand that got a good site prep on it at stand initiation and that maybe got a couple of burns before it was commercially thinned to start setting that plant community on the right trajectory. And then once it is thinned for the first time, then we really go after it with that burn rotation to try to keep things right and not even have to go with that, mid rotation application preferably.
Yeah. Good stuff.
So one other thing I was going to mention about Arsenal is that you can mix it in uh, to a tree injection solution as well. There was a student that I had finish up several years ago. Well, we've had him on the show before, Mark Turner. Since he's moved on up to Craig's lab and now he's in your lab,
Yeah.
but and soon to be elsewhere after
Yeah,
that.
he won't be here long.
Right, but so he's making the rounds. But yeah, Mark, as part of his master's research when he was here at Auburn, he looked at adding a little bit of arsenal to a more traditional tree injection solution to try to increase its spectrum of control. And we did find, in fact, that adding arsenal to the solution of Garlon 3 in water broadened its spectrum of control specifically to include hickories. So if you're ever doing any FSI, as we've talked about before on the show, forest stand improvement, trying to remove low value trees for turkeys to increase sunlight to the ground, develop that understory a bit, and allow the crowns of desirable trees to expand, you might want to mix in a little bit of Arsenal AC. And we have an episode where we talk specifically about that and give you the ratios and all that stuff.
Mm-hmm. We can link it in the show notes.
Yeah.
So that people won't have to look for it. Did you have any more?
Yeah, so I also added triclopyr. Mostly what I'm talking about here is Garlon 3A. Um, and, it's a common forestry herbicide that you'll see used throughout the lower coastal plain of a lot of states in particular. And that's because it is, specifically effective against more of those waxy leaved plants that we talked about earlier that were fairly resistant to glyphosate. Um, so it's a really good chemical for that. It's a really good chemical for hardwood stem control overall, as is similar to imazapyr. But one of the differences I think between imazapyr and triclopyr that strikes me the most as a habitat manager is I feel like after an area is broadcast treated with imazapyr, in the following years you're likely to get a lot more forb response.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas with triclopyr, I feel like you're more likely to get a native warm season grass response.
Yeah, I'd agree with that.
So if you want to increase grass coverage, triclopyr
That's
is a
what we
good one for
need.
that. But and I
If
mean
y'all
native,
listen to our reaction show,
yeah,
we had several videos
yeah,
on grass.
right.
And I didn't point it out, but I thought it several times. Like, what else is a grass? Corn.
It is indeed.
Yeah, that was fun. It felt like a meta-analysis, I think was what we said. A meta-analysis of this show, but man, grass was a big part of that meta-analysis.
Yeah, it was.
So I don't think getting more grass is necessarily what most people are looking for, but they can decide that on their own, I guess.
There was one more that I had on my list to get to today, and this is another one that you'll see, pretty regularly used in forests, but it also has a valuable field application as well, and that's Escort, which is metsulfuron methyl.
Mm-hmm.
And in forestry, for forestry objectives, oftentimes you'll see it used for herbaceous release of pines. You'll also see it tank mixed and applied with arsenal to broaden the spectrum of control. So particularly arsenal isn't very effective against blackberry, as Marcus already mentioned. Winged elm is another species,
Mm-hmm.
especially on Piedmont sites, that tends to break through after an imazapyr only application. And I've seen a few places where it's not something I used to worry about as much, but I have seen, as I've gained experience, some places where winged elm can almost be as bad as sweet gum
Mm-hmm.
in terms of forming an understory or a midstory within a stand that you're trying to burn and manage with fire for turkeys. But more importantly than that, the use case that I implement this herbicide more so for than any other is to control Bahia grass and Sericea lespedeza. And the reason for that is that it's particularly effective against forbs. So keep in
Mm-hmm.
mind that if you broadcast apply this herbicide, your forbs are going to take a hit for a while.
Mm-hmm.
And it's up to you to decide, like we talked about at the beginning of the episode, whether that trade-off is worthwhile for you. But
Yeah.
in terms of trying to control Bahia grass, which is an exotic invasive grass that poses a problem for turkey, particularly turkey brooding cover in open areas throughout the coastal plain of the southeast. It's very effective at that. And then Sericea, or Chinese Lespedeza, some people refer to it as, another very problematic invasive species that has a region-wide distribution and even beyond the region of the southeast. We talked to, Luke Garver recently, and he was talking about how it can be a problem even up in southern Illinois.
Mm-hmm.
So this is a pretty effective chemical for that use case as well.
Yeah, it's good stuff. Yeah, I was hoping you were going to bring Escort in because that was one of them I had to talk about as well.
Yeah.
And I did want to take a moment to point out to our audience, we're talking about turkey habitat because this is wild turkey science, right? But I don't want to give the impression that it's only solving that issue.
Right.
That developed mid-story, whether it be sweet gum or winged elm or a variety
Maple.
of other things, privet, it doesn't matter. That generally is degrading habitat quality for a large portion of our wildlife species.
Mm-hmm.
And we're looking for an open forest structure that is absent of mid-story pretty much entirely. Yeah. And that was the historical condition in most of our eastern forests. And a lot of our wildlife species are well adapted to take advantage of that type of structure. Mm-hmm. So when we're talking about trying to get rid of the mid-story with, from a lot of these weedy hardwood species, that's why. But not only is that beneficial to turkeys, it's beneficial to most of our other wildlife species, especially a large portion of them that are on the species list, that of concern.
Yeah.
Right?
That's a good point.
The same would apply in these fields where we have these sod-forming grasses. They're a problem for turkeys, especially at the poultering stage, but they're also a problem for a lot of our grassland obligates or assisted species that are of conservation concern.
Yeah.
So don't think that's the only thing you're accomplishing.
And one other thing I want to add to that too is if you're also thinking about forest ecology over the longer term, not just providing good turkey habitat for the rest of your life, but thinking, in ecological time scales. So we're talking about, hundreds of years and beyond. There's pretty good evidence out there now that some of those species, particularly like the one you mentioned, Chinese privet, or, maybe it's bush honeysuckle elsewhere, it can actually alter the species composition of that forest long term by preventing certain species from germinating and replacing the current overstory over these longer time scales. So like privet in particular can form such a dense midstory that essentially as the overstory ages out and dies, it's replaced by privet.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Yeah, it's affecting all kinds of things. The nutrient cycling, the pollinator assemblage, the ant assemblage, the soil microfauna. I mean, it's huge effects on the way the system functions, and we kind of get into this alternative stable state because of it. So it's a good point. I have another one or another specific topic.
Okay.
Unless you have something else you want to talk about.
Nope, that's all I was planning for today.
Okay, this one's probably a little more specific to turkeys because it comes up when I'm talking to people about turkeys with field management.
Mm-hmm.
And that is if people are trying to plant chufa, it's really common that people plant the same fields over and over again. Mm-hmm. First of all, I think one thing that we need to talk about more probably is that you should probably rotate chufa.
Right.
So maybe 2 years in a row you plant chufa, but try not to go longer than that and move the fields. And one of the major issues that comes up with chufa specifically is it is a nutsedge, and you have other nutsedges like purple nutsedge and yellow nutsedge that become weed problems. And, there's unfortunately, when you're planting the chufa, there's not a lot you can do about it. So
Right.
you're rotating it, and when you don't have it in chufa, take advantage of that opportunity to try to get a handle on the nutsedges. So we've talked about some herbicides already that are pretty good for nutsedges, but I think we talked about glyphosate. Remember, the Liberty doesn't have any activity on it. What else did we talk about? We talked about atrazine. It does okay. Basagran is really good control on nutsedges. Dual Magnum and Bicep Magnum, those have really
Herbicide names always crack me up.
Yeah, those do pretty good. Eptam also does pretty good on it. So you have some options to deal with nutsedges. And if you're planting something other than a nutsedge, you have a lot more opportunity, to try to deal with that problem. But man, I have seen a bunch of fields where people had planted chufa several times in a row or something else and just not dealt with the nutsedge problem, and it can really cause big issues.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up too, because to take this concept even more broader, if you have a particular area of your property where you really struggle with a problematic broadleaf weed, maybe, especially if it's a planted area like a food plot, maybe just go in and plant a cereal grain for a year or two, and that allows you to use a selective herbicide just to kill that broadleaf weed. So, like, for example, let's say you had a broadleaf weed in a food plot, just go in there and you would normally plant like your cereal grain with your clover. Just leave the clover out and up the rate on the cereal grain for a year or two, and that allows you to just use 2,4-D to target the broadleaf weed problem. And you can do the same thing by potentially just going with a broadleaf crop in a field where you particularly have grass weed problems.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, make it easier on yourself.
Yeah.
It's the same. I see the same thing with the chufa. Like, man, I want chufa, but I got all this other sedges, and I just can't do anything with it. Like, what are my options? Don't plant chufa. Take care of the problem. That's what your option is.
Here's another idea that takes it even a step beyond what I just described is let it be fallow for a little while. And just spray those problematic weeds out and let the good stuff come in.
Yeah.
I mean, really, if people would just know 2-3 dozen plants in their area, they could take this much, much further. And that maybe sounds like a lot to some, but if you're learning 3 or 4 at a time during each season as you go about your property, and you just stay diligent about that, you'd be surprised by how quickly you can start to recognize 90% of what you see.
Right.
There's going to be some rare stuff.
Same would apply for these herbicides. Like, have a good handle on 3 or 4 from each category.
Yeah.
Right. With knowing 8 or 10 herbicides and what their uses are across the spectrum.
Yeah.
You can knock out a lot of your problems with that.
Or you can just buy Craig Harper's Food Plots and Early Successional book.
Yeah.
And it's got
reference it.
I do too.
I reference it constantly.
I do too. And it's got an awesome section in the back where he's taking the time to put together almost exhaustive. I mean, it's not exhaustive, but it's dang close to it list or a table, and it shows different herbicides and mechanism of action and plants controlled, plants not controlled, objectives. That thing is invaluable.
Yep, I agree. Good stuff.
Yeah. Well, hope that helps y'all out.
Yeah, any other herbicides that you can think of or any other things that we need to cover?
Disclaimers: always apply herbicides in accordance with the label. The label is the law.
Yes.
If you actually apply amounts per acre greater than the label, you could potentially run into some legal trouble there. And then one other thing that I'll mention too is we didn't even talk about surfactants. So if you're following the label, you'll also see, whether the herbicide that you're applying requires a surfactant, and if so, what type of surfactant. And that is an important step that I feel like a lot of people miss out on or overlook. And it can really make a huge difference in the level of control and success that you actually achieve. And you're already spending, in many cases, a lot of money to put that herbicide out there. So you might as well make sure it works. Hand in hand with that, calibrate your damn sprayer.
I was wondering if you were going to bring that up.
Well, I hate that it took me this long to say it,
Yeah. Calibrate your sprayer. Make sure that you are following the label.
Yeah.
Because you don't want to waste product either.
Yeah.
Right? You also don't want to over-apply something that's going to really cause problems.
Right.
Some of these soil residuals in particular could fit that bill.
Yeah. I mean, I get several questions a year, almost without failure, from landowners saying, well, I'm going to spray this area with glyphosate. I've got a 30-gallon sprayer. How much glyphosate should I add to the tank? And I can't answer that question because I don't know at what rate your sprayer is applying, chemical or water, what volume it's applying per acre. So you need to know what volume your sprayer is applying per acre, and then you can make the calculation to determine how much herbicide you should add to the tank.
Yeah.
And it's not hard. It's not.
Yeah. Well, and also notice we didn't focus on what the rate is, like what your combination is. You need to get that from the label. Follow the label.
Right.
But important part of following the label is knowing the rate of dissemination of the product. So
yeah, if you don't know how much water you're putting down per acre, there's no way you can figure out how much chemical to add.
Yep. So okay, well, hopefully this covered a wide spectrum of the relevant herbicides.
It's a primer.
It's definitely not exhaustive. I mean, these things are coming out so fast too. I hear about new ones all the time.
Yeah.
So
there's a couple of them that I've got noted over here that I need to look into, that a few people have told me recently, oh, we applied this one or that. And I'm like, I don't even know what that one does. Never heard of it. So I'm trying to keep up.
Yep. I've had to do the same. So, anyway, we don't necessarily need an exhaustive list to be able to, accomplish a lot of our objectives. So
right.
Hopefully this helped people along on that front. But acknowledging that we are not the herbicide experts or trying to exhaustively cover everything there is to know about them.
Mm-hmm. All right.
Good stuff. All right. Thanks everybody out there for listening. Of course, if you have feedback or would like to hear, something like about this again or something else, I mean, we are being responsive to our listeners. We're trying to, at least.
Yeah.
And this was listener driven again.
Yep. Agreed.
So thanks for that feedback, and let us know if you want something else.
Yeah, we appreciate it, and hopefully y'all are starting to get to enjoy some time in the woods.
Yes. I got to enjoy the dove hunt. That's all I've got to do.
Was it a good one?
It was okay. It was influenced by the storm negatively.
But
there was a bunch of new hunters, so that was fun. I'm really trying to provide opportunities to people to get into the sport, So.
Yeah. I feel like it's been a tough year for dove hunting. There are a lot of landowners across the southeast that were particularly impacted by drought too. Mm-hmm. This year, that late summer drought that we had caused a lot of dove field failures, so that's frustrating as well. But
yeah. Well, and the place I was going to go dove hunting has been underwater because of all the repeated storms. Complete opposite end of the spectrum.
It's not one thing, it's another.
Yep.
All right. See you, man.
All right. See you later.
Wild Turkey Science is part of the Natural Resources University podcast network and is made possible by Turkeys for Tomorrow, a grassroots organization dedicated to the wild turkey. To learn more about TFT, check out turkeysfortomorrow.org.